Cool. So thank you very much for coming along. I know it's quite late, so welcome to number 2 in our webinar or seminar in Adventures in Infrastructure Design. This episode, we're going to talk about the submission, because I think there's a few people online that are a little bit fretty, a bit upset or worried. It's Friday, isn't it? Is it, guys? Is it Friday?
I think so.
I think it's Friday. Yeah. Friday early morning. Is anyone going to... Friday. Who's submitting?
Hoping to.
Roger, Graham. Yeah. Roger is, Graham is, Folders, I think. Igor.
There's a few.
Well.
Yeah.
Okay. So there's quite a few people. Cool. So thank you for joining me. I'm very honoured to have some newly minted VCDXs, along with a very experienced VCDX, and also someone who's just done their VCDX defence. And we'll talk about their experience along the way. So we've got quite a packed agenda. Depending on the time frames, I've put me down last because I might drop mine out depending on the time, and I'll give out the mind map afterwards, depending how we get on, because I know it's late. But we've got design process and methodology. So I've been trying to talk to Jason for a while, and it's been completely my fault. So I do say sorry for that. Every time I try and talk to her, I get pulled into one of those annoying meetings where project managers talk to me. So I really do say sorry for that. But what we got, I think what caught my eye was that Jason started drawing out the methodology, and I thought that was that made quite a nice chat, and I thought that was quite cool. So I think Jason's going to start off. We've also got chats about SLA and risk by Paul. I think Paul went through that quite well in his mocks. He obviously did well in his actual real one, but in his mocks he sorted that out pretty quickly. We're going to talk about defence experience. So Brian's going to go through his experience of the actual CMA and see what that's all about. I'll be interested in that because it's one of those things where, no, I'll never do a double VCDX, but you never know. You never know, do you? You never know.
I've said never, but we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. This time next year we'll all be millionaires. So and then we'll talk about the real world. So it's VCDX versus the real world. There's a bit of a that's the main event, I think, for that. That's going to kick off. That's going to be some mention of VCDX day. I think that's going to be it. And I think if I get chance, I've got a mind map, one of my mind maps that I put together, and we'll talk about the things that I've seen. So I think for the past, God knows, since I got my VCDX, I think I've done about 20 or 30 VCDX reviews as a mentor, and pretty much everyone's doing the same thing. So I thought I'd knock up a quick 5-minute presentation on saying, don't do this, do this, and don't do what Paul did. Yeah, and also some last-minute changes because some people are going to start doing their submission finalising by Friday. I thought we were going to talk about that. So again, just to caveat this, because we're going to be recording this and putting it out, all presenters have no knowledge of the VCDX scoring process. This is all community-driven. It's not for money. It's all for the love of it. And firstly, before we go on, I would thank all the presenters for spending their time just to help little old me put this together. So I do really appreciate it. So we go over to start with Jason. And I think, Jason, would you like me to give you presenter?
Sure.
Or have you got it?
No, I don't think so. No, yeah, just chuck the ball over my way, and I'll share my screen here.
Pop that over to you. There you go.
Alrighty.
Yeah, we can see that coming up.
So everyone can see my screen?
I can indeed. Yeah.
Perfect. So we're good to go. Are we recording or?
Yeah. It's all recording.
Yeah, I see a little blinking red light now. Yeah. Whoops. Sorry. Perfect. So my name's Jason Grierson. I'm VCDX number 206. For whoever hasn't bumped into me along the way, I got some contact information at the bottom there. So of course, if you have any questions or anything like that, feel free to reach out to me. I always try and do my best to get back to people and answer the questions to the best of my knowledge. With that going on, I've had the opportunity and the pleasure to try help mentor some of the recent VCXs that have come up, and there was kind of a trend that was going along. And what that trend was is, you kind of go through the blueprint, which the DCD kind of starts the groundwork for, and then the VCDX blueprint obviously elaborates more on, and that's you're taking certain processes. So you're taking, AMPers, your availability, manageability, performance, recoverability, and security, and then you're marrying that with, requirements, risks, constraints, and assumptions, and then you're kind of tying that all together with your conceptual design, logical, and physical design for the chapters in your design document. So once you finally got that all together and you marry that together, you get a document and you submit it. And then, you submit it. And this is a little fun. If your VCDX document is this long, you're going to have a hard time. But
yeah, love you, I think.
Yeah, so you submit this and then you get the acceptance email, right? So, and you're like, okay, wow, what do I do now? How do I take this document that is usually quite large and I make it into a successful VCDX defense presentation? And I know for myself, I struggled with this a little bit because I think my document was roughly 230 pages at the time, I think. So how do you take 230 pages of design decisions, diagrams, and all those sorts of things, and how do you make that into a presentation, especially a presentation that's 75 minutes, which realistically for me, that worked out to about 20 slides that I wanted to present on. And the reason why I fell on that number is I took the time frame that I had. So I took 75 minutes and I divided it by 20, and that roughly gave me 3.5 minutes or so per slide to get my point across, answer questions, that sort of stuff. So that was kind of the benchmark that I went for. And then, of course, in my presentation, I had a bunch of other slides, like, backup slides, additional information, things of that nature, tucked behind the scenes that I could jump to if they brought it up. But kind of, I get this question a lot: is how do we get there?
Mm-hmm.
And that was something that that's why I kind of started trying this out, and I threw it on. When I threw it on Twitter, I was, just kind of trying to visualize what that process would look like. And when I kind of threw it up on Twitter, it blew up more than I expected it to. But when I sat down and thought about it, I'm like, what do you want out of a presentation from the VCDX's, I guess, blueprint? And what you want to do is, I think the first and foremost important thing is your project overview, right? So the best way I could describe this to people who are going to be, pursuing their VCDX or defending their document is kind of pretend like you have the customer in the room and they've either never read your document or loosely read your document, and you need to paint a picture or a story that is going to satisfy not only C-level and higher management people that have somewhat of an understanding, but some of the deeper technical people that might be in the room as well, right? And the first critical part of that is the overview. So why did the project happen? What does the company do? What's the driving factors for the project? What are some key success factors or key service objectives or business objectives and goals? Because no company is going to do this kind of a project just for giggles, right? Like, there's obviously a driving factor behind it. Where we want to get better return on investment, lower total cost of ownership. Maybe it's a customer satisfaction that's driving the project, or a faster times for the application you support. That's really important, and the reason why that's important is because it's going to lead into the next part of your project or your defense, which is going to be your requirements, constraints, and risks. And when you talk about these things, that's going to kind of start to pull those out. And then also, when you go to defend things, and this is something we'll talk about in another slide here, is it's easier to defend when you go back to those, opposed to getting stuck into a technical rabbit hole. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But what you want to do is, so once you kind of have your project overview, so you stand up and you give them a good overview of how the company works, the who's, the what's, and the whys. Then what you want to do is you want to take the design methodology that we saw a slide ago and kind of marry that together. And this was kind of my visual representation of that. So what you're doing is you have a conceptual design, which is going to be fairly basic or lightweight, where you kind of get the idea of what you're building, and then you're going to be marrying on AMPers on top of that, right, for each section. So for availability, management, performance, and you're going to pull out those requirements and constraints, and you want to be able to talk to which ones fall into which buckets, right? And this is something that kind of carries over from the DCD, where you had those wonderful drag and drop questions that everybody loves, which is like, certain requirements and constraints are going to fall into these buckets. And I think from a presentations perspective, especially when you're defending for your VCDX, that's incredibly important that they see that. I think, like no one knows what the rubric is, but I think it's very important. And I think it's, it really shows that you've gone through the design methodology, and it's a way to scoop up some points for yourself. And then of course, once you have that done, you're going to be doing your logical design for each one of your sections. So compute, management, storage, network, virtual machine, security, monitoring, backup, restore, and then business continuity and disaster recovery. And each one of those sections is going to, that's going to encompass your design. And then of course you're going to be marrying in the ampers there as well. And it's really important that when you're going through your presentation, like, you're going to have a slide that says, okay, here's my compute logical design. You're going to have your logical design might be up there, and then you're going to have a bunch of key design decisions that was the hinge pin as to why did we go this route with compute? Like, why did we do this instead of, 24 rack mount servers, or why did we go blades and this? You're going to have your key design decisions that are going to marry back to the ampers. It's going to, why did you go up instead of out? Well, performance with this constraint and this requirement, that's why we went in this direction. And then that kind of loops back into the project overview. So when they understand that and you're talking that, it's really easy to defend certain decisions that you made, opposed to technically trying to defend it. Because if you technically try to defend it, what will happen is technically there's so many different ways to do something that you can just sit there and argue about it forever. And then you look up at the time and you're like, holy crap, like 40 minutes of my 75-minute time slot just disappeared on one section. But if you go back and you defend it based off business requirements, it's really easy to get the point across and move on and keep going. And that's what they're really looking for. They're looking for you to marry that together and to show why you made the design decisions you did based off the requirements. And then, of course, at the end of it, if you have time, future considerations and improvements. And this is an opportunity also to show that you've thought about other design factors, where we could have done it this way, but because of this constraint, we couldn't. Typically budget's a big one there. And so sometimes there'll be decisions you made that you had to cut corners, or certain things had to be done a certain way because of the requirements or constraints. But down the road when new budget comes or certain things change, here's some things we can do to do that, or to help with that. And that's kind of just a visual representation. And then there is a piece missing here. So when I first put this out, and I said, any other feedback or considerations, let me know. People are like, well, what about the physical layer? You're leaving out the physical layer. That's really important. And I think that's a key point, and that's something I want to talk about. So we have a second diagram here. And the physical layer is very important, and I left it out. I left it out for a specific reason. And the reason why I left it out is on Twitter, I had a very short amount of information that I could get in, and it's a talking point because some people, every VCDX you talk to kind of has a different experience. Some people, they put this into their presentation a lot, and other people put less in there. My personal standpoint is if there is a very important design decision in some of the chapters as to why you did certain things physically, put it in. But otherwise, you have a very short time period to get stuff done. So some people decide to put that in backup slides, that they can pull up if need be. Also, the physical layer is really tricky sometimes with some of your sections in your design. So for instance, virtual machine or management typically might not have a lot of physical design in it, especially if management doesn't have its own cluster. If it's already incorporated into your main cluster, you're like, well, then it's a couple of VMs or a couple of software pieces, or monitoring, for instance. How do you physically draw out monitoring, right, from a physical design aspect? So some of those, obviously you can have backup slides or do it differently. But this was a topic I had a conversation, and I opened it up to everyone here as well. We can that can discuss this and go over that with their experience. But for certain areas, I would definitely do it. In other areas, I might chuck it into backup slides. But it is part of the design methodology, so it has to be in your document without a shadow of a doubt. But from the presentations overview, certain sections, it's a little tougher to kind of physically get that across, or you can have backup slides with, the tables or the hard settings and that sort of thing. And then of course there's assumptions, and that sort of stuff. And, if with certain assumptions, they can generate risk. And then the rest of the slide looks the same. And then at the bottom, I have backup slides. So for instance, for me in my document, I had about, I think it was 100 backup slides or so of like all the little settings and things I could jump to if I had to get in there. One thing I do highly recommend though, and I've seen this from feedback a lot with the VCDX process, is don't be afraid to use the whiteboard. So even if you have a backup slide, feel free to use it in your presentation, but don't be afraid to jump up there and use that whiteboard. I think they really want to see those skill sets too. And I think the mock design question you get in the second half definitely helps with that, but they like to see that from a presentation skills point where they say, well, how does that striping work in your storage? I've never worked with that storage before. Don't be afraid to get up there and draw it out, but there's no harm having the backup slide in case you get into trouble, right? Like you forget something, or there was just too much to memorize, or you wanted some extra help and that sort of stuff. So I guess before I open up the questions, and we can jump back and forth between the slides, the last thing I really wanted to get across to drive the point home when you're defending in your presentation is, why do we start IT projects, or why does the business start IT projects? And I love the pyramid because I kind of saw this in one of the other presentations I was in where, for us, it's the cool features, or maybe the management interface makes me hate my life a little less. But realistically, the main reason is because it's going to solve a business problem or need or fulfill a requirement, right? It's going to make the business's life better. And this goes back to what I was talking about a slide ago when I said when you are defending your slides in your presentation, make sure that you shift from the technical mindset to the design mindset, and use the requirement constraints and ampers to your advantage. A lot of people think that the requirements, constraints, and those things in your document are kind of like a hindrance. Don't think of them like that. They're a huge advantage to you in defending your decisions as to why, and it lets you answer a question quickly and move on, and so the panel isn't picking on you for 10, 15 minutes on why you just did that design decision. Like a good example of this is SSL certificates, right? And security in general. Security is always a double-edged sword. Security and management are always going to fight. The more you lock something down, the harder it is to manage. The easier it is to manage, the less security there is. So there's a problem there, right? So obviously you're going to draw a line in the sand at some point, and you're going to defend it. So instead of arguing technically about it, it's really easy to say, well, based off my business requirements, requirement 001 or whatever, and ampers, the management aspect, there was no driving security adherence I had to do to put these SSL certs in. So from a requirement this and from a management standpoint, they decided to go with this, or this was a better decision for them. In the future, there's no harm in doing it. We're not preventing it. It's just that, and then it quickly they go okay because they can't pick on you anymore about it, right? Because the company accepted that design decision, it fulfilled their requirements, and then you can move on, opposed to getting into the whole conversation about SSL certs and root certificate, CA authority servers and all that sort of stuff. So that's kind of all I really had on that. I'm going to open it up to the table, and we can jump back to the kind of diagram I threw out. But I don't know if people are joining or leaving. So it's like, wow, I've had 15 minutes and I got 6 people to run away already.
Leave and come back again. Thank you very much. I think I was listening to that. They kept dropping in and out for a second. I wasn't sure why. No, but thank you, Jason.
Yeah, so I'll open up the questions. The last thing I would like to say as well is if you do not pass on the first attempt, don't feel afraid, or don't feel like it's it's a huge setback. There's so much to learn. What you learn during the process is the most priceless thing in the VCDX journey. Of course, the number, everyone wants to get it, and the end goal is always there. But everyone I've talked to that has maybe in the first defense didn't make it, or second defense didn't make it, there's been a lot that they've learned from it. They've always walked away. So don't be afraid of that. Just go in there, stand your ground, and do what you got to do to get there. But yeah, if there's any questions, I don't want to eat up too much of everyone else's time. We can jump back a couple slides. Any kind of questions or?
Yeah, I think from my point of view, I think the way you described the logical design was where you concentrate on. I think that resonated with me. I think so I wasn't successful the first time out, and I think I concentrate on trying to get as much as possible in my presentation, and I concentrated physical, and I didn't forget, but I didn't really push out to the panelists what the story was. And I think making sure you give your use case and why you're doing things can save you a lot of hassle. Because you don't get stuck somewhere. You can't get stuck in like this little rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's very easy to get stuck in the physical rabbit hole. Also, too, like I have some examples here. Like another thing too is people say, how do I get these tables into a presentation that gets that marriage across? And everyone has their own way of doing this. So this isn't gospel or anything like this, but this was just a slide out of one of my presentations. And just making sure that you get those ampers in there and go back to that a lot and those design decisions and those sorts of things because I think it really shows that you've gone through the methodology and understand it and those sorts of things. But it's very easy to get trapped in the technical conversations and the physical layer for sure.
It is. I think when we were going through in the last batch of people who were successful, I think a couple of people, they were all physical, or they were mentioned brand names or whatever, and I think that was
essentially me.
Yes, hi, buddy.
Yeah, that was essentially me.
It was you, wasn't it? That's right, Dell.
Dell. Everything's Dell. It's wonderful. Yeah, but it took me ages to click the story. But the thing is, in my head, I had the story, but I was too busy talking about the physical that I wasn't conveying the story. As soon as I got my head down conveying the story, and as Jason said, relating everything back to the business drivers and the requirements, they can't argue with it. And you're doing it for that reason and that reason alone. So once you convey that, you're pretty solid.
It's hard for them to pick on you.
Yeah,
because
absolutely.
You know the business, they don't. So if you say the business wants this and you've supplied those requirements, it's really hard to argue about it, right? Yeah. Unless it's something so fundamentally broken that they're like, well,
unless it won't work. I think because I think you made a great point when you said, when people see the requirements constraints as a hindrance, that's actually your story being brought out for them. And as long as you can filter back to that. I remember in my successful defense, I had one person in the panels who was saying, "Are you sure about that? I'm not quite sure why you actually did that." And I kept relating it back and standing my ground, saying, "Well, let's agree to disagree." He was perfectly polite. He was a lovely person, but he went through saying, "Why did you do this?" And because it went back to the story, there wasn't really much. I had a reason, and I had a technical reason as well as a business reason, and it seemed to work. So I think that's a really big thing, that you don't dive straight away into, dash.isolation address equals whatever. You're a million miles away from that. You're looking at, the whole estate and why you're doing things from a business perspective. But no, cool.
Hey, hi, Jason. This is Ankit. So I just had a question on your slide here. The way you have categorized all your requirements, constraints, and risk is kind of innovative for me, because I've seen this for the first time and I very much like it. But the question is, did you categorize every requirement, every constraint, every risk in your document in these categories in the presentation, or it was just some highlights?
Yeah, so. In my documentation, I highlighted it in some. When I was helping Shady, because we did a shared design, when he went back for his subsequent defenses and pass, we did a better job of documenting it. And let me I don't know if so here's an example of this. So in my table, you can still see my screen?
Yeah.
In my table here, for instance, I have design quality. So this is, from an Ampers perspective, we're fulfilling availability and recoverability. And then from a goals and requirements standpoint, we're fulfilling R01 and R06. And then in some of it, not in my presentation, I didn't marry them as well into here. Like outside of the buckets that I dropped into here, I talked about them a lot in my presentation, but I didn't physically have them in the presentation. But Shady in subsequent defenses did, and I think it helped them. I don't know if I have the networking. I can probably pull it up, but
Okay.
yeah. So he did put, so for instance, in one of my networking, like my networking diagrams for how we logically mapped the VNIC from a UCS chassis to all the way down to the VDS,
Right.
he would put in brackets, you know, after that design decision, like R0 whatever was fulfilled and those sorts of things. Not only so that it's on the page when you're talking about it, but also as a member, and so he could talk about it. I didn't, because I defended, like when he passed, there was a learning curve and a certain amount of time where we went and improved on things. I talked about it, but you know, it's nice to have it up there because even if you miss it, it's a bullet point, right?
Right.
It's whatever you're comfortable with. It's the best point is to try and get the story across, and everyone does it a little different. I've seen so many mocks, and I don't think I've ever seen anyone do it the same way twice.
Okay.
But yeah.
Oh yeah. So okay, I see on that slide you say major requirements. So basically, you have not listed out all the requirements that you may have listed in your design document, right?
No, so these were major ones that I pulled out, and it was because of the way that my design had to be told from a stories perspective. So like I can load mine up here. So I'll show you what mine was like. So I had my project overview. I talked about the company, why they had to do what they were doing. They were shifting into a digital format because it was a newspaper printing company. And then because of we had such strict constraints, especially around budget, like they filed for Chapter 11. So they were like on the brink of bankruptcy. We quickly realized there had to be a roadmap. So we did phase one. And phase one was the only part that my project was around, right? And it had a lot of risks involved in it because we couldn't, DR wasn't until phase two. So there was a lot of things that were due. So I talked about goals and major ones, but when I get into, for instance, the, like, you know, the other pieces of it, like the, you know, the compute and that sort of stuff, I talk more about the design decisions involved with that. And then this is a case where later on Shady would put like R01 or, you know, what that design decision fulfilled. So, but it's optional. Like you want to be able to marry that together, but everyone does it differently. So there's no kind of like 100% way, but that's typically what I see. And I don't know, maybe some of the newer people can talk about their experiences and stuff like that, about what they did, and then you can kind of get an idea of the direction you want to shoot for.
No, I mean, for me, it's quite impressive. It actually makes a lot of sense instead of going through that design and actually just showing the relationship, how you achieve that. I like that, actually.
Yeah, and it's just really good to, when they ask you questions as to why, you can really leverage that to your advantage, right? Because sometimes in designs there's going to be certain things that, like recently with you know, like a perfect example is recently, you know, say you overbought or over provisioned a data center, right? But the reason for the customer was that like the vendor just gave it away. Like they just gave me a deal of my life. I wasn't going to say no. Like, you know, they gave me an extra 3 servers for free. I'm not going to not use them. So like every now and then you'll get a weird design decision where they're like, well, why would you do this? This is so over provisioned. And you're like, because they based off budget constraints and the requirements that they had, like this happened, right? So it's easier to defend that opposed to running down that technical rabbit hole. I hope that kind of answer the question for you.
Thank you.
Jason, it's Roger. I've heard a few people say that around the presentation side of things, it can be beneficial almost to place very deliberate kind of honeypot type questions so that you're drawing like a magpie attention to those particular things so that it's clear that you're not only addressing things that you feel you can score points on. Do you have any kind of real life example of that where you may have done that in your design presentation?
Sure. So for instance, and this is part of the process too of this guy here, right? Like getting this huge document down into slides. Like for instance, compute. If I remember correctly, like my compute section had my design was full of tables like this, like full of tables. So which ones do I really pull out and talk to? So how I'd answer that question is one, the defense panelists have read your design and they've made notes on your design. So that they have a pretty good idea of what's going on from your design document. So I called out the critical ones that I felt were important that fulfilled the business requirements. If it was something smaller, I had it tucked away in a backup slide. It's not that I forgot about it. It's just a matter of getting the important information across in a short period of time. Because, if I were to put all 23 requirements in that one section on a page, I wouldn't even be able to fit my document on it. But there is a bit of depending on who you talk to from a VCDX standpoint, who's gone through the program and passed, there's two kind of groups of people. There's one that says, don't put anything on the page you don't want to defend on because they'll pick on you on it. Like, don't put anything there because it's essentially giving them rope to hang you. But then there's other people that say, that are the other part of the group that are like, well, I feel it's like I'm going to put everything out there and just have a really good answer to defend it. And if they pick on me, they pick on me because I want to show that I've thought about it and maybe scoop up a couple more points. Mm-hmm. Which way is better? I can't say because no one knows the rubric, no one knows the scoring. But if there's something that's just not really relevant or you're not really comfortable about it, I would just leave it in a backup slide. And if they pick on you about it, go, oh yeah, here. And you click on your slide and it jumps to it, right? Mm-hmm. Sure. From a presentation standpoint, like I had these buttons that you can see here. These buttons were like my oh crap moment buttons, like where they asked me something terrible and I had to go into like, a lot of detailed stuff, like tables of decisions that I made from a calculating standpoint, right? So if it's something like that would be my recommendation. If it's something you're uncomfortable with and you don't think it's a huge design criteria, put in a backup slide, link it in there so that if they pull it out, you can talk about it. If they don't, then you don't have to worry about it. My assumption is they typically will pick on you on things they feel they had questions about when they read your design, but no one will ever tell you what they're actually thinking from a defense panelist. But that's my opinion, anyways.
Sure. No, that's very useful. Thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Thank you, guys. So, thank you, Jason. I think that was a great presentation. Got some good questions there. Thank you very much for taking the time to put that together. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope it helps. If there's any other questions, I'm always free to talk about it, for sure.
Cool, thank you. I think the next person we've got is Paul. Is Paul online? We good?
Yeah, I'm alive. Can you hear me?
I can do indeed. Yeah. I was going to give you the little ball. It's bouncing over to you now.
Oh, lovely.
There you go.
This is the point where I try and figure out how to use WebEx for the 9 million time.
We can mock you while you're learning that. Yeah,
do it. Go for it. Just revisit old fun and games. So, can you see my presentation? The full screen?
Do. Yeah, we can see the full screen now.
Yeah.
It's nice to see the number as well.
Yes, of course. I had to put it up
there. You beat me to 250, Paul.
Yeah, I knew I would. I told Paul I would, but I didn't really believe that.
I was saying to him I did say that the day before the defense, and on the defense I said Mr. 250. I told him.
Yeah. It's positive reinforcement.
Yeah.
So okay, guys. Hi. As we just heard, I just was thankfully successful in the recent round of defences with Bilal, and thanks a lot to Paul McSharry for his help and various other people in the community. So I'm on Twitter as well at Paul P. Meehan, and if I can help anybody in any way, please feel free. I'm on the Slack community as well that Greg Robertson has set up that we should probably mention as well later on. So today I want to talk about risk and SLA, two of the things that probably were like signaled the doom for IT guys in the past and for me as well. But VCDX has kind of really given me a different perspective on, as kind of Jason kind of alluded to at the beginning, you kind of look at constraints, you look at risks, you look at assumptions, and they're a little bit kind of hard to pin down. And I think risk is really true as well. But actually, when you kind of begin to get a much more fully formed design, you'll realize that using risk within your design is like a powerful weapon to allow you to kind of make specific decisions and to justify certain, decisions against requirements. And that's something that personally, I try to bring that into my defense as much as possible proactively. So if I presented a slide with a design decision where I could, I always try to introduce, I made this decision, it did introduce a risk of ABC, but I mitigated that risk by doing X, Y, and Z. So I tried to preemptively meet any potential questions that the panelists might ask me. That worked for me, but through the whole process, I learned a lot about how to manage risk. Just going back to the blueprint, as always, and on every pre-VCDX session that was run by VMware, if I heard the phrase, read the blueprint, read the blueprint, read the blueprint, once I heard it like 1,000 times. And I probably did read the blueprint 1,000 times over, a number of years. But if we kind of look at the requirements for risk management in the blueprint, I just kind of acknowledge what VMware is saying here. So the first line that I've underlined is kind of calling out to me that VMware assume that in all the submissions they will receive, that every design will have risk, not just in decisions, but in many, many areas of the design. So that's something that they expect a VCDX to manage. But it also says to me, and I think most people would agree, no design is going to be perfect. And as Jason kind of said, and Bilal said, you'll have reasons why you made specific decisions, and some of those decisions will have risk. And as long as you can justify those both in the defense, but also in the document, then you have, a strong argument to convince the panelists that, he could have done A, he could have done B, he chose C, but he had a really good reason for doing it. He's aware of the risk, and he also has a plan for dealing with that risk. So on the second, or the kind of risk identification factor, then they talk about implementation. So to me, that talks about, project risks when you implement your design in production, in test and dev. And then the next piece is the operation of the architecture. So when you actually bring that architecture into production, how will you manage risk throughout the kind of the ongoing life cycle of your design as you kind of grow your environment and grow the storage, etc.? How do you know that those risks will be contained after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, etc.? Those are things that you need to take care of within your design. And by doing so, you can balance off a lot of those design risks with specific plans to target how to deal with them. So the next bit then is providing solutions to address, mitigate, or eliminate those risks in the design. And then the final one is kind of probably carried by both your validation test plan, which you have to submit with your design document, but also your standard operating procedures. So you can make a design decision and document the risk that brings into your design and into the operations of the environment, and then have a validation approach or a test plan and a specific ongoing activity, could be weekly, monthly, or whatever, to make sure that you keep that risk contained. So you validate it in the first instance as part of the deployment, and then you manage the risk as part of the ongoing operation of the environment. So how I kind of went about that was to kind of look at this as, if you kind of think of it in terms of pre-existing risk within your environment. So it could be something to do with organizational, like, for example, a lack of vSphere skill within the environment, or immature monitoring processes, or those kind of things. It could be to do with, project deadlines. In my particular design, I had a 3-month change freeze window from October to January, and that dictated a lot around the project timelines that I had to kind of build within my project plan that I submitted it. So you've kind of got these pre-existing risks that you can probably document pretty soon, before you kind of put the document together. But as you write the document, you should go through every design decision and try and consider, what's the risk of this decision? does it, you know, have an impact on the ability to meet a business requirement? So you might have a requirement that says, you know, CPU is critical for, you know, mission critical applications. It could be driven by an SLA for the business that if they don't meet it, that performance degrades, and that could ultimately affect consumer response time or something like that. So you have to kind of go through your decisions. When I started, I probably had 6 or 8. I don't know if you remember, Paul, but by the end, you probably should have, depending on your design and the complexity, 20, 30, that kind of figure of specific risks. And as I said, some will break down operational, some will be technical. And once you have them documented, then you can kind of put a plan in place for how you're going to deal with them. Sorry, Paul, you were going to comment there.
That's fine, don't we? No, that's fine. Carry on. I think you covered it. Go on. That's no problem.
Yeah. So a big part of it really is kind of balancing, making your design decisions, and as I said, trying to bring risk within there and acknowledge it in the first place. Don't be afraid of it, but use it to justify your decisions. So, for example, on the slide, I had a decision to make about a single wide production cluster versus a number of smaller production clusters. And when I made my defense, I went for a single production cluster, and there were 3 specific risks, which I've called out on the slide here, that could have impacted the production applications and could have affected user response time, and in my case, the ability to actually underwrite insurance policies. That was the business that my design was based on. So the way I dealt with that, I had a number of mitigations. One was the use of specific automated kind of alerting using dashboards, but another one was manual tasks that compared the system and the performance of the system to a baseline, you know, at the point of deployment, to kind of compare the initial with the kind of current, and kind of put some eyes on that. So and then I also had alternative and future things that I could have considered, such as reservations, which in the end I didn't implement reservations because I had a requirement to maintain management, or kind of to reduce management complexity within the design and make it as simple as possible. So I made a decision that I didn't want to complicate the cluster design by introducing DRS affinity or anti-affinity rules, reservations, but I did have this risk. But from a utilization and kind of optimized cluster design perspective, it provided me with a lot of balance, with a lot of benefits. When I actually documented the risk in my design, this is an example of another one, which was to do with my decision to use tin provisioning at vSphere level on top of the tin provision storage infrastructure. I made that decision despite the fact that in a worst case scenario, it could have led to I/O being stopped on all volumes being presented by the storage. And I mitigated that, and this was kind of taken out of my design, kind of paraphrased, by using a combination of specific vRealize dashboards leaning on the vendor's management packs with specific alerts going to named users, and then standard operating procedures. You can see here I've documented monthly 02, and if you go to my SOP document, that defined a specific, you know, activity that needs to be undertaken by a specific member of staff on an ongoing basis. And in there it says, you know, you need to follow this process to compare A to B to C, etc. That's kind of how I dealt with this specific design and how I dealt with all of the risks within my environment. I did kind of cross-reference within my SOP back towards the risks. So I had this kind of circular referencing from one place to the other to show that I tried to kind of make it easy to navigate from the document itself into the SOP, and then if they went in there, they could see, yeah, he's got a risk over here, risk X, Y, and Z, and now I'm looking at monthly 02, and I can see the whole thing is kind of tied back together. I did that as much as I could because you always run out of time before the submission, and that happened to me. I kind of thought at the beginning, there's no way I could leave out major sections in my response or in the document set, but inevitably you kind of notice things that you need to work on and that you need to rewrite. And that takes time away from kind of making all these little adjustments as you get closer to submission. So that was kind of my experience with risk. But as I say, it taught me a lot about, looking at risk in a much more positive way and using it. So initially you think constraints maybe is like a magic bullet that can make some bad situations go away, shall we say, and make it easy for you to make design decisions. I think most VCDXs would say that that's probably not going to be a defendable position in the panel, that they probably won't let you away with such an easy kind of get out as that. You still have to have thought through it logically. And, my favorite phrase is critical thinking about VCDX, that you look at the decisions and your design and really think critically and say, well, can I really stand over this decision? Is there a risk? If there is, how am I going to mitigate that risk? And can I defend this whole thing to the panel? I think if you have that kind of rounded story about risk, then you'll probably be in a good place. As I said, my approach was to try and go a little bit on the front foot. And for each of the pillars, compute, network, storage, management, I tried to, if I could, always, make the statement about how I manage risk. So anyway, it worked for me. How much, I don't really know, but it is what it is. So before, I just have a couple of slides on SLA. I don't want to take up too much time, but just to kind of cover, there's loads of different service levels and different kind of KPIs you can use. But again, from the blueprints within the VCDX, the three key ones are obviously availability and recoverability, and then performance. And I think these are ones that you kind of have to cover. There's no way around it. There's no avoiding it. And you need to have a very coherent story in terms of how you meet SLA and how you use SLA to meet the requirements, that Jason kind of alluded to, how you can take business goals, requirements, map them into the functional requirements in your design. And some of those could be related to SLA. And, the panel are really, really strong on SLA and really, really specific on the kind of questions that they're going to ask. So it really needs to hang together well. It needs to make sense, and you need to be able to defend it. As I think Bilal said, in my defense, I had a couple of SLA that the panel questioned and kind of said, well, why have you got that RPO and that RTO? It doesn't really make sense. It seems like you've got it back to front or upside down or something like that. And I had to kind of go to the whiteboard, draw out, why it made sense for me, how it kind of worked based on a typical day or whatever. And when I did that and it made sense to me and I was able to convince them, they accepted it, and then they moved on to the next question. So I kind of got some questions for an aspiring VCDX, and I would highly recommend that for this particular area, Renee van der Bedem has some great blog posts on SLAs, on some kind of critical thinking about SLA management within your design. So the first question that you kind of have to ask yourself around your story is, what are you protecting against within your design? What are the specific failure scenarios that you got? Within mine, I had three primary ones. I had protecting against logical corruption, protecting against site failure, and protecting against rogue administrator access within the design. And they were the three that I kind of brought to the surface as much as possible. And within my SLA, I was always thinking, okay, how do I achieve a site failure with that? Can I actually meet the SLA based on the three scenarios that I've constructed? One thing to note, don't forget to include things like maintenance windows in your availability SLA, and make sure that you factor them into your operational procedures. So, for example, you might have an ongoing process to apply patches. You can obviously include that within a maintenance window, and that can avoid you affecting the SLA and the ability to meet that SLA. So that's kind of, something that you might not be thinking about, that you might have to adjust your SLA from 99.9% to some other figure based on that. So recoverability, one of the key things that didn't really kind of, again, it's to do with the coherency of your story, is if you don't have a management solution, how are you going to recover your production environment? Which elements of your management solution need to be in place in either site, assuming you have a dual site scenario, to be able to recover management? So the SLA around management and around production from a recoverability perspective are key. And the story that you've got and the ability to, so the first mock defense I ever did, I was asked that question: how will you recover management? And that means in detailed steps, what are the steps to follow? And if Paul McSherry asked me that once, it must have been at least 5 times.
I think he did. I think he did that a few times, yeah.
Yeah. So you kind of need to really have, don't be afraid of addressing these questions and of really thinking, because this is what will make you into a VCDX, to really say, okay, what is my story about this? And you may need to add fictional components to your design to be able to have a strong story that you can stand over in your defense. I know I did, and I had to rework a lot of my SLA design, because at the beginning, I started with 4 or 5 9s, which I soon realized would be quite difficult to defend based on the fact that I didn't have any automation within my DR process. And then from a performance perspective, it's kind of one thing to say, yeah, I've got, 1,000 IOPS on day 1 with a latency of 4 milliseconds. But how can you make sure that after 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, that you can continue to meet that SLA? And that is kind of something that the panel will ask you about. Like, so how do you respond to SLA failure after 6 months, after 9 months? How are you mitigating that? Like I mentioned dashboards already and risk, but how you operationalize a lot of these kind of risks and decisions. So how do you expand your clusters when you run out of space? How do you expand the kind of the performance capability of your storage infrastructure if you met the IOPS limit? What are the steps that you need to follow? I think most of us who've been through the process have kind of addressed the operational side of it as well by using some kind of slide that showed these are the steps that you would actually follow in a real event. This is how you would kind of this is how the help desk flow would be, and in some cases we have slides around things like ITSM to show the way the organization works as well.
Yeah, one other thing I'll just jump in and mention, Paul, is when in the early stages when I'm mentoring people, a lot of times I'll see what you just said is there'll be a much more relaxed RTO RPO on the management software side or the management piece. So then you get that question and you say, well, what happens in a failure if your RTO and RPO is 24, 48 hours on management, but you have 4 9s over here for production? How, it's kind of the chicken before the egg type of thing, right?
Yeah.
So I see that a lot. And then with the performance SLA too, another good question that I see a lot is how do you measure it? And also too from the uptime perspective, that's change control and monitoring and different things. I know when I was in my defense, they asked about that as well. They're like, how do you manage? How do you ensure that you hit that SLA and that sort of stuff? But no, I just wanted to add that in. But yeah, good point.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks, Jason. Yeah. I think it's absolutely, I think measurement is one thing I didn't mention there that Jason has kind of put his finger on. Like, you could be asked about things like, what's the impact of not meeting an SLA? Is it kind of business risk, or is it, could it actually affect the ability of your client to do business? So all of these questions kind of are relevant for an aspiring VCDX. And the more coherent the story, and as I said, you might need to add some components, you might need to change your SLAs. As I said, the panel will ask you how and why, and you need to have thought about the answers in advance. Luckily, with the kind of community and the number of VCDX that are mentoring, you will be asked those questions a long time before you hit your defense, and it may make you go away and rethink how you did things. And that's kind of part of the whole process for me, that at the beginning, everybody's design is a bit of a kind of I think Bilad's going to talk about real world versus, VCDX, and that's the reality. It's not perfect, and it evolves over time. So don't feel intimidated by the fact that you may not have a lot of the stuff in your design today. You will at the end. I just want to put up one one last slide here. I mean, everybody would love to have 5 nines and 6 nines and, you know, be 100% availability. But the key thing in VCDX is increasing amount of automation that you need to require. So if you're only allowed 5 minutes of downtime per annum based on 5 nines, and you have like an RTO of, or here I've got a maximum tolerated downtime of 1 hour, then you've breached your SLA for availability. So the story here, it could be that in the event of a site failure, I don't have the same availability SLA that applies. That's not what I did in my design. I had a single SLA for availability because, as I said, I was mitigating site failure. So if I had the figures in the bottom of this table based on 5 nines, my recoverability SLA would have broken my availability SLA. To make sure that those two things are coherent and are kind of lined up and make sense, because, as I say, I had one that was okay, but the panel still questioned it to make sure it made sense. At the top of this as well, you can see I had a different SLA associated with my management cluster. It was much kind of softer in terms of the availability, but it was still fairly aggressive in terms of the time that I had to recover all of my management in the event of a site failure. So I've got a couple of other slides, but I think I'll wrap up there because I don't want to take up all the time. So if anybody has any questions or want to throw it out to the floor, welcome. Go ahead. No? All good?
I think we've got one.
So, Paul, in a design, if you are designing a totally greenfield environment for a customer, but you are co-hosting in one of their data centers, right? And I mean, maybe in your design, if you had it, many customers have legacy systems which are running UXs or maybe mainframes, right? So ultimately, even if you can provide 1 hour or 2 hour RPO on the virtualized infrastructure, but ultimately in the bigger picture, if the mainframes are not synced or the HP UXs are not synced, ultimately the entire application cannot enjoy that kind of RPO. So if such questions come up during the design, if you state that that because of that limitation you are not able to meet that RPO or RTO, will that be justifiable, or I mean, how can you handle that situation?
I think as Jason said, if you have a business requirement that you don't meet, so for example, you have some kind of requirement around SLA and you can't meet it or meet the RPO and RTO in your design, then that's kind of a bad place to be. You know, because as I said at the start, SLA adherence is really critical. And if you have multiple elements in your application, for example, or your infrastructure, and each one of those is required to deliver the SLA as a unit, then if some elements of that can't meet that SLA, then as a designer, you could be questioned to say, well, you know, does your design, you know, you can't meet your requirements. I know those kind of black and white questions have been asked in the past. So I would kind of consider the ability to fictionalize, you know, I mean, you can, as Jason said, he justified it, I think, without a DR in phase 2. Some people, you know, I kind of enhance my DR design to kind of, you know, show, as they say in the document and in certain places, the mastery of, you know, VCDX. But other people can justify it with a strong enough set of business requirements or budget constraints, as Jason had. I think if you can justify it based on a kind of a clear story in the back, then the panel may accept it. In my case, I kind of decided to tweak my design and add some additional components, and in some cases reduce my SLAs to be able to kind of, you know, have a kind of be able to hit all the boxes and all the silos in the way that I chose. And I'll let other guys comment on that as well.
I think you hit the nail on the head. Am I coming through?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. You might run into those odd situations where, for whatever reason, you just can't comply. And like Paul was saying, if that mainframe is critical to the SLA of whatever the service is that's important to the company, then that's a critical risk that you have to mitigate the best you can in the document, which people will do one of two ways. They'll either fictionally change the document a little bit just to suit the VCDX, from the design's perspective, or if you keep it in, you have to do kind of what Paul did with his cluster risk when he started his presentation, where you say you call out this risk immediately, you talk about all the constraints, requirements, and amper reasons as to why you did that design decision and why it had to adhere that way, and then you also talk about what we would do, in the event that we didn't have those constraints in the defense. So you say, this is why we did it, this is how we were constrained, this is the workaround we used. The customer is extremely aware that, this is a huge risk and it's not the way we should do it, but because of what's in place for the time being, this is what we've done to mitigate it, and this is how we want to change it in the future. So even though I didn't have DR in my design, I talked about how we would do it and the problems it fixes when we do put it in, right? So like the SLA problems we had, the recovery problems we had, I'm like, all these problems go away once we do this. So I think that way they'd give you the points and hopefully leave you alone a bit or let you move on. So there's two ways you can kind of go about it, but yeah, there'll always be that. Sorry, go ahead.
I think just to build on what Jason said, I think it would almost be worse if you have a solution with a DR function and you have a totally incoherent story like I have on this slide here, that the panel will kind of say, well, DR is a fundamental element of your design and you've broken your SLAs and can't meet it. I think that would be very bad for your defense. You may be better to be able to justify it, as Jason said, and have a really strong story and have thought through everything and say, it's a phase model, whatever. So I think it's, it's 6 of one, half a dozen.
Yeah, like I think it'd definitely be tough, right? Like I'm sure they'd give you might lose some points there, but you'd manage to maintain some opposed to just it just falls apart on you. The other thing you could do too is break out SLAs into different requirements if it's less from a business functioning standpoint. So say the mainframe does something else for the business that isn't customer facing, and customer facing is where the revenue is. You might be able to break out a separate SLA there and say, it has its own application replication and stuff like that. You might be able to scope it out, depending on like the Unix, like the mainframes and UX and AIX systems and things like that that we can't virtualize. You might be able to do it, but it just depends on the situation.
Okay. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
All right, guys. Just to kind of show, Jason put up his slide. I mean, I kind of used format that was kind of, everybody has their own format, but this is like my kind of logical network design. This is the kind of approach I chose. You can see here, I actually included my design decisions, my logical decisions on the slides. But the best advice I got for presentation about within each slide was probably call out 2 or 3 major decisions within this and talk about those. And Rebecca kind of, Fitzhugh even talked about maybe, imagine that you kind of have to almost draw it and you don't have any decisions, that you have to kind of, you have to explain it without all this text on the screen. How would you go about it? But this is kind of an alternative to what you might have seen before, but that's been my approach, is to keep it concise and stick to 2 or 3 points per slide. And the panel will kind of take it down different directions anyway, but this is the way I went. Okay, so that's, I think I'm going to wrap it up there, Paul. And
cheers, Paul. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. It's been really good. Yeah, no worries. It's been really cool. I think you brought out some good bits there. I think the big bit that I liked was the operationalising risk. I think that's a big piece that I've seen lots of people, myself included, when I started out on the VCDX was, oh yeah, it's a risk and it's accepted. Yeah, that's not going to work. And I think the method that you said, where it goes round and round and round in a circular way, I think that's what you aim for. I think that's, if you think, I think you're ready if you can answer any risk with a standard operating procedure. I think it really shows you've done it. But yeah, cool. Thank you for that. Cool. So I think we've got Brian coming up next. I think Brian's going to give an experience discussion based on a recent defence with the CMA. I think, are you there, Brian?
Yeah, I'm here, guys. Hi there.
You good?
Hey,
Yeah, good, thanks. So I'll
That's
just
good.
share my screen.
Excellent.
Okay, you guys see that okay?
Yeah, I can see that coming.
Good stuff.
yeah, boy.
Well done, mate.
So-
well done.
The guys done a great job there presenting some really technical stuff around the VCDX. My thoughts for this was kind of not be light-hearted, but try and just go over, after my initial disappointment, kind of look at what I did wrong, where I feel I could pass tips on to those guys who are going to be submitting this week. So I've not got any nice images, but I think it's good to chat around kind of the steps of the process, if you like, from my experience. So a few bullet points here, but I'll just kind of speak. So I know there's a number of guys who are submitting this week. So once you do that, I would say take a break. You've done great to get this far. You've put the work in to get it submitted. But take a break, because honestly, the bad news is that the work is just starting now. And that's why I'm saying mock. I did not realise at all, and I had 100 people told me VCDX is an effort. You have to really be focused on it. It will take up all your time. And I just thought, yeah, no problems. I'll be able to work around it. Everything will be fine. And it's not until you start mocking, you start to realise the work that's ahead of you. You're going to get questions thrown at you that you might never have even thought of as part of your design. Even if it's a real world design and you've done the start to the finish to the deployment, there is always something which someone will ask you, and you'll never find that out until you start mocking. So literally take a week off and then just ask the guys on this call, approach people on Twitter, and just start cracking at it. My first mock, I felt I wasn't ready, but honestly, no one, you'll feel the same. No one's ready in their first mock. And guys like Paul McSharry and all the new VCDXs and Jason have all been great to put out their time. So the community is definitely behind everybody trying to achieve this certification. If you can achieve go into any of the face-to-face mocks, it's worth their weight in gold. So the week before the guys on there in my defence, we'd done a face-to-face in London. I had the pleasure of seeing Paul Meehan's defence mock, and it was amazing. And there was some guys there who are thinking about submitting, and I'm sure they came away realising how much hard work they still had to do. So if you can get to face-to-face mocks, try that. It is definitely worthwhile. And as you see here, there's times you're going to feel that you know nothing, but it's already been touched on. For me, I can look back and say, you know, you come out of it with an email saying you failed, but when you look back from where you were 6 months ago to now, you can see the massive journey you've taken. You have to basically take the failure on the chin, for me. Be honest with yourself and look at where it went wrong. So for me, I seen there was a couple of guys in the NV track. I done CMA, and it was quite hard to find any CMA VCDXs who I could approach and get mocks with. I spoke to Greg and Sam McGeehan a few times, and they were great, but DCV tracks obviously got so many more where everyone can fit the time in. One of the problems I felt was that I focused too much on the DCV track. So if you're doing NV, try and get a group where you can kind of, if you're both doing NV or there's 3 or 4 of you, find an NV who's passed it and work with them predominantly. That's not to take anything away from the study group I was in. It was really great, and I learned lots and lots, but I feel for CMA you're abstracting from a layer that the DCV concentrates on, and I think I made the mistake of focusing too much on that rather than the sort of abstract part of it for the CMA. I also felt like I neglected things like exercise and routine. So exercise is obviously crucial for the brain to take stuff in and start to really engage to what you're reading about. And I felt like I focused too much on VCDX. It got to the stage where it was almost like an obsession, where I had to spend 5, 6, 7 hours a night just doing it. So step back at times, make sure that you're still getting some personal time and keeping a routine in your life. I can look back and say at the start of this, I had a really good routine where I was getting up early, I was studying, I was doing my work, then I was spending a few hours at night studying, and that worked a lot better for me than basically obsessing over it and spending 6 hours at a screen, because you're not necessarily taking it all in. You have to listen to your brain, make sure that you're actually, the investment you're making, you're getting a return on it. So there's no point in neglecting your family for 6 hours if you're not benefiting from that 6 hours. So please listen to your body, listen to your brain. It's kind of something that you might not think about when you're doing an exam, but you can start to obsess over this. So yeah, definitely. I also realised that my design was too real world. So the guys kind of spoke on it there about whether you put DR in or not. For me, that was one of the decisions I had to make. So my design was real world. We were offering a private cloud through a managed services company which I worked for. So as an example, the customer doesn't really care about the management stack. So we only had internal SLAs. But I think going forward, when I do this again, I'll definitely have proper SLAs in place, because for VCDX that was just completely wrong. Jason mentioned it there about even seeing less SLAs for the management stack, but for me, we didn't really have any SLAs for the management stack for the customer. It was only internal KPIs. So you do start to pick out things that are maybe too real world for VCDX. I also suggested that DR was in phase 2. If you do have time, and that's you kind of similar to me, I would personally say you have to put DR in there. I think I lost points for not including it, even though in my presentation I had a DR slide and I could speak about how we would do it. I think if you can speak how you've tried and tested and done DR testing, I think you would definitely gain more points. And also don't neglect the design scenario. So you have to remember that this is equally as important. One of my mistakes again was spending too much time obsessing over mocks and my own presentation. But you also have to remember that as part of the design scenario, you may be asked to design a solution which is out with the technology of your own design. So you may be doing an active-passive DR, but you might be asked about active-active DR. So there's things you have to actually look at out with your own design. So please don't neglect the design scenario. I think I've done 3 or 4 attempts at a design scenario before the defence, but I've heard people doing 10 and 12, and I think that's probably a better number. Bilal and I were lucky enough to do face-to-face design scenarios with Rebecca Fitzhugh, and I think had it not been for that, maybe I did fall flat in my face. I thought it went okay, but it certainly wouldn't have got anywhere near that had I not, practiced that a couple of times. So please don't neglect that. And then the defence itself. So don't stress about going into the room. Honestly, it was something that I kind of thought about. I was nervous around. I'm sure everyone is about going into a room full of experts, but it's not like that. There was, I felt, a misconception around the panellists and the whole process for me. I'm sure the guys that sat it recently, we had a lot of discussions about what it would be like. I don't want to say scaremongering, but there are some people out there who will make it not look harder than it is, but the guys are brilliant. The panellists are definitely there to help you. So don't worry about, thinking they're trying to trip you up or they'll throw any curveball questions. They're definitely 100%, from my experience, there to help you through it. Not at any point did I ever feel that they were going to trip me up. That said, don't think you're going to get through your presentation in sequence. I went in there, introduced the background, spoke about some SLAs, and then was asked a question which was completely unrelated to the slide. I had to kind of scroll to the latter part of my slide deck to answer it. So don't expect to go from A to Z. You'll have to jump about. I think it's been touched on that some people had hidden markers to move between slides or backup slides, which is a great idea. Personally, I initially had a lot of backup slides, but I cut it right down. And I think my presentation was 21 slides, and I finished that with 30 seconds left on the timer in the defence. So, yeah, I mean, think about how much you can get through when you're looking at your presentation deck. Don't overload it, but also remember that you won't get to do it in sequence. Some of the questions flying around before our defence was whether the panellists actually read your design or not. So my first couple of questions were unrelated to the slide I was on, and then the next few were unrelated to anything I had on the slide deck. So definitely to a degree they do read your design, I can tell you that. So make sure that you're not, if someone says they don't read it, I would take that with a pinch of salt. You have to assume they've read every single page of your design. And then be confident, because a number of times they kind of pressed me for certain design decisions. Actually, they kind of said, there's white papers for this, that these have just been released, so you're wrong, but you have to kind of stand by your decision. The particular decision they quizzed me on, I had actually tested it thoroughly, so I was very confident in my answer. And that's maybe one of the problems of having not a real world design where you've created your own design. You might not have the confidence to respond back, but you have to just stand your ground and make sure that you push back, and ultimately they accept that. So yep. And then what went wrong in the defence? Sounds silly, but try and look at more how the design impacts the end users. So I think I looked a lot more technical. You have to remember this is a business exam as well. I was asked some questions that caught me off guard. They weren't necessarily any requirements that I had from the customer, but you have to, these questions can still come at you. Think about questions, even if they're not a requirement or anything. Try and think, how does the user think? How would a dumb user get asked a question? Because these are some of the questions that the panelists might throw at you. And make sure that you're clarifying some questions. So remember, the panelists are human as well, so they might not form a question as coherent as they wanted to. I don't know if that's intentional, maybe it is to try and trip you up, but I don't think so. I think sometimes they're just human. So make sure that you're speaking back the question in your understanding, and make sure you're actually understanding that question before you answer it, because the last thing you want to do is go round in circles and kind of answer something that they didn't actually ask you. And it was mentioned there as well by Jason, I think, use the whiteboard. There was a particular point in my defence where they asked me to speak about how monitoring hang together and how Log Insight and VROPs hung together. And by chance, that was my next slide. They did hint me to use the whiteboard, and in retrospect, looking back, I think I lost points because I didn't pick up on that. So at any opportunity, I think, as was mentioned, try and use your whiteboard as much as you can. And then for me personally, I could see that I lacked some knowledge on monitoring and security. Those were neglected perhaps by me, so I was caught out on 2 questions, I think one each for monitoring and security. So please remember to look into that, make sure, because definitely for me, the monitoring design wasn't something that I personally designed, and I know you'll hear 100 times you have to have a holistic view, but it sometimes is easy to neglect the things that maybe you didn't participate 100% on. So make sure you're confident in security, because I think that caught some more people than just me out on this defence. And that's really it. I wanted to keep it short and sweet. If there's questions, please fire away, and if not, get me on Twitter, and I'm more than happy to discuss my defence in more detail with any of the guys that need it. If anyone is doing CMA out there in the call, then please also give me a shout and I can speak to you. I'm not sure if there is, but I'm open to help you guys out.
Thanks, Brian. I think that was really good. I think we went through some important bits there. I think learning from it is a big deal. I think I've been there, so I know how it feels. Are you aiming to go back in at some point soon?
Yeah,
not
this defence. It's came too quick. I wanted to get feedback, etc. But yeah, hopefully for the September submission, I'll kind of, as I said, I can see that there was perhaps some 2 real world mistakes I made. Certainly became apparent through the mocks as well. But hopefully can get that dusted up and then submit again in September. But
I think you and I had a chat about that, didn't we? You and me went through that before when I said that I had the same thing. My first defence was, it's working. I built this. I know it works, but it may not have matched all the areas that we wanted in the defence.
I mean, the key thing is to remember it's an exam. You know, it's an exam as well. You might have the perfect design for that customer, but you have to make sure, like Paul mentioned, you can expand on the design, and don't be scared to do that. You know, expand on a design you have and take different parts of a design you've done previously and merge it together. You know, if you've got the confidence of that decision elsewhere, then there's no problems merging it in.
Yeah, I think so. Because I think if you think, I only realised this till when I was successful, but if you think about the panelist's job, not that I know anything about the Rubik, is that they've got to validate that you can do a design for not just this customer, but your future customers. So you may not have needed a DR plan in a certain, in the one that you're presenting, but they want to know that you could do it if you asked at another time. So I guess that's that aspect as well. But no, cool. Thank you very much for that. Appreciate it. And good luck with your future one as well. I'm sure you'll nail it next time.
Cheers.
No worries. I think we've now got Bally. I think we've come to a very good point actually, because we were talking about real world versus VCDX, and I think it's the main event. I think.
Yeah, the main event. No pressure.
That's it.
No pressure. Right? Can you
No
pass
pressure.
over the ball, please, Brian?
Sorry, what was that?
Over there.
I passed it over to you now. There you go, mate. You've got it now.
Okay, cool. Let me just share my screen. Right, can you guys see that then? Yeah.
Can indeed.
Okay, cool. So, real world versus the VCDX. This is something that caught me by surprise, and I think it caught Brian by surprise and Paul Meehan as well a bit, as in like, we've got this real world design that we've done bits and bats on, and then we realized as time went on that we I know for a fact I dug myself a little bit of a hole in certain areas because I kind of kept it a bit too real world. Now, a little bit about me in general. Day to day, I'm a vSphere and storage administrator. I've done a bit of implementation here and there, but and a bit of design here and there, but design has never been my biggest focus. So the VCDX was more of a personal challenge for me more than anything else. I wasn't really bothered about a pay increase or anything like that. I wanted to prove to myself I could do it. And that's fundamentally why I did it more than anything else. And that's why I put myself through the rigors of this, which a lot of you are now experiencing firsthand. I'm a big Batman fan, if you haven't guessed already. I blog with a bunch of guys at V Musketeers, and you can hit me up on Twitter if you have any questions as well. Now, as you can see here, a lot of people that I've talked to have done designs that are partially fictitious, which is perfectly fine because you might have a good base, solid design. But as well, you've got to remember that it's a certification, a VMware certification more than anything else. So you've got to hit the points in that blueprint, and you've got to score your points. Yeah, they want to see real world aspects, and I got the impression that they can tell when you try to make your life too easy. They can smell that bullshit a mile off. But then again, on the flip side of that, if you make it too real world, are you going to score the points in the right areas that you need to? So it's a bit of a juggling scenario in that point, because we don't know how it's scored. I mean, I know I made adjustments in my design to make sure that I was hitting the blueprint where possible for DR, for recoverability, for manageability. I made sure every design decision related to some point, to some aspect of the blueprint. I mean, now, as I was going through my mocks, I realized that I'd made my life a lot harder than it had to be. I'd made certain design decisions. I was like, yeah, I can defend that all day long. And then when it came to the mocks, I was like, my answers were crap. And I really couldn't defend it anywhere near as well as I wanted to. So I had to go back to the drawing board and look at the various design decisions and be like, okay, I'm defending it in the wrong way. What I need to do is I need to defend it relating back to what the business needs and what their requirements are. Remember, there are 3 of them and there's 1 of you. Do you really want to get into a technical deep dive with them? I know I don't, because I'm going to be wasting my time. You know, and as I said to one of the panelists, he's like, you could have done this instead. I looked at him and I said, a very British term, I go, it swings and roundabouts. Yeah, that could work, but I believe the way I did it works better because of this requirement because I have to have something that's easy to manage. And I believe this design, this decision meets that requirement better than that. And after that, he was okay. He was like, yeah, that's fine. I agree with you. And we moved on. Remember, always relate back to the business. The story, the business, the requirements, the constraints, they're all part and parcel of design. You base your design around that. So have a good, coherent story about every aspect of your design. I thought I did have a good, coherent story, but there were a few mocks where my story started to unravel a bit, especially around certain points of my design, which meant I had to go back and have a look at those bits of the story and amend them and make them more airtight. And you only realize that in the mocks more than anything else. And that was particularly more around my DR scenario point of view because I was doing a kind of active kind of solution. Now, in a lot of my original mocks, I was told that I didn't have a story. And this, I couldn't quite grasp what they meant. Did they want like a happily ever after at the end kind of thing or something like that? But once I chatted to Jason and once I chatted to Paul and McSherry about it, and we took away all the vendor knowledge and we just went back to the business and we talked about why the project got started and why each design decision was done the way it was done. It started to click for me, and once it clicked, it flowed really, really well, and my presentation went really, really well. And when I was up there in the panel, it went really, really well. One of the key points in the panel was that the questions that they were asking me were all fair, they were all perfectly valid, and I could blatantly see why they were asking me them. I got the impression they wanted to see that I'd made the decisions for the best reasons for the customer. That, yeah, I could have done it another way. They wanted to see that I'd evaluated the other possible options, but the reason I went with this one was because of X and Y requirement or because of this constraint. And that's something that I can't stress enough because that helped me an absolute load when I was actually doing my presentation. And
I could tell when you made that turn because it was like a light switch in your mind.
Yeah, I've noticed with me that it takes me ages and ages to get it, but once I get it, it clicks, and then that's it. There's no going back at that point. I even had one of my other partners, Kim. He was very surprised at the instant switch that I had going from one to the other. I just dropped all the technical stuff. I could talk technical all day long, but that's not what the presentation is about. And as soon as I was like, before I was arguing technicalities, why I picked this HA policy and that HA policy, I said, no, I picked it because I have a requirement for user management. End of story.
Yeah, I think that way. I think when you went through with me, I think it was like 20 minutes or so, and you weren't going to talk about anything else but just the story. I think that really did help along the way. I think you were completely different. You'd studied it and you got it.
I got it. It took me ages to get it, but once I got it, I was like, okay, I got it. Hallelujah, I know. But then again, I realized I made certain design decisions that just made my life fundamentally more harder than it had to be. And I mentioned to Jason and Paul and Brian, like, I made this decision and I had a good reason for it. But now looking at it, I'm like, why did I make my life so bloody hard? And end of the day, you want to score points. Yeah, you want to show your skills. But end of the day, you want to score the points, and do you have to make your life overly hard to do it? I don't think you do.
So you changed some of your work.
Yeah,
just before the defence, didn't you? It's not the end. It's not the end of the line. You can change things. Not too much, but you can.
Yeah, you can change it, and as long as you can justify. I personally believe that by changing this little key aspect of it, it was easier to defend, and I believe that defending why I changed it was easier than defending why I didn't use the feature.
Yeah, I think so. We spoke about that just the day before you went in, I think.
We spoke about it. I spoke about it with Jason. I spoke about it with Shady as well. And I was like, I'm much more confident about defending why I made the change. And I went into the defense, and as soon as that side came up, I just hammered it straight home, shoved it in their face, and I didn't even get a question about it.
So
I was like, yeah.
One thing you can kind of use to your advantage as well, depending on your timelines in your project, is if it's minor changes like that, you can say, in the testing phase, the customer saw the merit in going with this design decision instead, so we changed it. Yeah. So we moved here and we made this modification, right? So now
I'll give you a story.
If it's a wide swinging change, like you totally change the question or something, that's a little different. But
yeah, I mean, I'll give you a story. Like one of the panelists was looking at my design. He goes, your slide says one thing, but your design document I've got in front of me says this. He goes, so is this the actual design? And I looked at it, I go, of course it is. I go, in validation testing, the customer had initial concerns. That's why we used that saying. But in the testing, I proved that that wasn't a concern. So we went with this saying instead. Obviously, we tested it thoroughly, and it wasn't an issue, and he left me alone after that. You know, because I proved that, yeah, I addressed the customer's concern, and I proved that really is not a concern. And we've got this requirement for ease of manageability, so let's adjust the setting to meet that requirement. End of story. You know, and then they left me alone after that, and that was the end of that, really, more than anything else. And in the real world and in the VCDX defense, you're going to get customers who are going to ask you a question that's a bit off pan, that's completely valid. And like this picture, I had this in my defense where he asked me a question, and as he was asking me, I was like, oh my God, I cannot believe I didn't pick up on this myself or in any mock or anything. And I was internally screaming while smiling at him. I was like, Jesus Christ, what is going on? But then I asked him I bought myself a bit of time, and I asked him, you know, to clarify it a bit more. And as he clarified it, I'm like, okay, I get what he's getting at. So I said, look, yeah, that what you said is perfectly valid, and that was something that we considered. But end of the day, it didn't quite fit what the customer wanted, and I had this requirement for ease of manageability. And yes, there is a risk with that, but then we've got a good solid monitoring solution where they can monitor it, so it's not going to be an issue. And after that, he was like, okay, I agree with you. Yeah, okay, that's fine. And we moved on. You know, so I bought myself some time to think about a formula and answer, but I didn't get into a technical deep dive with him. I just got into why it was a better fit for the customer with what I did based on the requirements and the constraints that I had. You know, I had a major constraint in my design as well, that I only had a 1 gig link between both my sites. So I had to base my DR for the platform based around that. And I told the panel as well to their face, I go, look, if I had to do this, if I could change, one of the key things I would change is I'd wait till we had the 10 gig line in place, and then I would be able to design it in a much better way. I go, but end of the day, this is a constraint I had, and this is what I had to deal with, and this is how the design works. And it's done in such a way that when the 10 gig link comes online, I go, it's flexible enough that it can accommodate that without any issues. And they were like, fine. You know, so all the time I was relating it back to the story. They did have a few questions about my RPO and RTOs, but once I related it back to the customer and explained why the RPO and RTO fit the need for this platform and why it was perfectly acceptable, they were like, okay, I understand that now. That's fine. It makes perfect sense. And we moved on. You know, and as Brian has mentioned as well, the panel were incredibly friendly. I was joking and laughing with them while we were going through the presentation. They were asking me the tough, difficult questions. There were a couple of times where I said, look, I'll have to get back to the documentation. They were fine with that. There was by no means disaster. I was ready for some kind of like war when I walked in there, and then they were all smiles. We shook hands, we had a laugh, and we just started. And I just flowed with it. And that's all that you can do. End of the day, they want to see that you can present. They want to see you can build rapport. And I personally believe that the presentation side of things actually scores quite highly. I have no proof of that, but I think that's a key point, because a lot of IT guys aren't that good at presentations, and they don't want you to be a wallflower when you're with the customer. They want you to be assertive, they want you to be on point, and they want you to be able to lead the conversation and the flow. And
I think that's a big deal. I think using the whiteboard, and keeping the soft skills, I think that's
absolutely. I mean, they did ask me to whiteboard a couple of things here and there. Even though I had a slide for it, I pulled up the slide, but I also whiteboarded it in a slightly different way, just to show to them that I could do it and I could explain. And then they asked me a few questions, and then we just moved on. You know, and the design scenario as well, don't negate the design scenario, because you're going to have to do that in the real world in some way as well. I mean, the design scenario, they're making it up on the fly as well. Yes, you do have like a basic outline of, you know, basic kind of overview of what they want. But end of the day, they tailor it more towards you, because they're trying to pick up on the weak points that you didn't score that well on in your defense, and they're going to try and tailor it towards helping you score more. You know, and during the scenario, they contradicted themselves a few times. I don't know if they did that on purpose to see if I pick up on it, but when I picked up on it, I'd catch one of them out, and the other guy would then come to his defense saying, oh yeah, but this, you know, and be like, oh, okay, I get you now, and then I start drawing it on the board. But I made sure that if they made any contradictions, I caught them on it, and I pulled them out on it, and I made sure that I noted it as well. You know, just so just so you're scoring the points, because customers are going to contradict themselves all the time.
Yeah.
You know?
And also remember you can ask them. So
Yes.
things like you might not know the latency requirements, but just those guys are there to answer those kind of questions.
No, absolutely. There were a couple of times where I forgot I could ask him, and he was like, "Well, I can find that information out for you." I'm like, I looked at him, I go, "Well, go on then." And he's like, "All right," and he pretended to type something down, and he goes, "Oh, here it is." I'm like, "All right, cool." So I drew it on the board. You know, it was just a bit of fun and banter as we worked through a possible design solution that would meet what they wanted. You know, but you got to be able to handle yourself. My worst case was, my biggest fear was getting a question that I hadn't picked up on, and that actually happened to me in the actual defense. But I managed to handle it, and I managed to relate it back, and I could see what he did and why he was doing it. A lot of the questions I got were simply they wanted to see I evaluated other options, why I didn't use affinity rules, what were the risks of not doing that. And as soon as I said, "Oh, the risk is this," he's like, "Okay, fair enough," and then we moved on. They just wanted to see that, because the worst thing you could do is say, "Oh, that's the way I always do it because I believe it's the best." No. You've got to be able to say it's the best for the customer based on what their needs are, what the business goals are, and what their requirements are. That's the key more than anything else. Right, guys, that's me essentially. I tried to keep it short and sweet. Do you have any questions? If not, now you can more than welcome take me up on Slack or Twitter as well. You know, but key is, remember, it's a VMware certification above and beyond anything else. Score your points and don't make it harder than it has to be.
No,
I can't stress that enough.
I think that's a big deal. I think it is real life, and you do hear people, especially you hear it around the place where they say VCDX is a real life cert. It is, but I finish it with it's a cert.
Yeah.
And you have got a blueprint, and if you don't meet the blueprint, you're going to make yourself a little bit harder in the defense. So I think that's what I found out was you've got to hit all of it in the blueprint to get points to then score on top of it, not make it one area you're going to get picked up on all the way through. I think having a good baseline across all silos is important, but it is an exam.
I think Robert quickly mentioned that honeypots. So here in performance, I've got VAI. That was a blatant honeypot, and they asked me on it, and I had another slide for that. I went here. I went, "Oh yeah, let's talk about that." And like my storage array, that's a big thing about dead space reclamation, and we've got a script that does it to make sure that the storage is, what's shown in vSphere is actually replicated at the SAN level. And I was like, so I had something to go to for that, and I could get going with that, and I could score points. So that's a perfect example of a honey trap that I use, but I was confident enough to talk about it. And to be fair, they barely asked me anything on my storage design, and I actually think that's because I went into detail. I went into why I use physical RDMs. I went into why I had to use them, why virtual RDMs and why VMDKs just wouldn't work in this situation. And I think I did it in enough detail in my design document that I didn't even get one question about it in my defense. So, I think there's swings and roundabouts with how much detail you put in your design. But I think for key things like that, if you put in enough justification and you show that you've evaluated the other areas, you scored the points before you even get in there.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, going back to that point, like for instance, one thing I originally had on one of my slide bullet points before I went in, I actually removed it about 10 minutes before I walked into the room, was I had a design decision on fiber channel fan-out ratios. I hate talking about fiber channel fan-out ratios. Every time I have to calculate them, it's like I'm doing my taxes. So I just took it out. I'm like, I had it in my backup slide. I'm like, they asked me, I'll go to my backup slide, but I just don't want to talk about it. So, yeah.
Yeah, see, once again, it swings and roundabouts. Do you put it in? Do you put it in? So you've got to understand what you're comfortable with doing. You didn't want to get into fan-in and fan-out ratios. I wouldn't want to, so I'd take it out. But VAI, if they want to talk to me about it, I got a slide for that. Let's do that.
Yeah.
I got asked by one of the panelists to so one of my mock defenses with Renee, he said, well, you work for a storage vendor, so you're never going to be asked any questions on storage. And all I'd say is that that's totally not what happened and was totally unpredicted or not what I was expecting. But, it involved whiteboarding and drawing on pictures of how, different things work. So you kind of have to be prepared for anything.
Yeah. you've got to know your design inside and out. You know, let's be real. That's what it comes down to. You're the one that did it. Even if it's fictitious, you did it for a customer, and you've got to know it inside and out about why you made all the choices that you did and why it's the best fit. End of story, really. That's why you know your customer better than anybody else.
Yeah, one other thing I'd mention it too, Brian touched about it on it a lot in his presentation, is don't get discouraged. It's a huge learning curve all the way through the journey. You know, especially when you get to the presentation. Like Paul said, everyone who mocks for the first time, I've never seen anyone mock for the first time that just like knocked it out of the park. Like it's a learning curve. You're going to get better and better, and you're going to get torn apart. But every time you do it, you get torn apart a little bit less. And the more you can do that, the more prepared you're going to be for the defense. So, you know, mock as much as you can and don't feel bad. It's a large learning curve, and everyone goes through it. They go through the journey. So, just always keep that in mind. I
mean, absolutely. I had some absolutely disastrous mocks, but looking back on them now, perfect. It made me go back to the drawing board in a few areas and get my story sorted and pull out people who worked with just business presentations all the time. You know, I could talk about single points of failure all day long, but why is that relative to the business? Because it's going to cost them money. Okay, so talk about it in that kind of way. You know, those type of things. And once you get that, then it'll start gelling and it'll start coming together much easier for you. I know that was the case for me.
Yeah, I always joke around because everyone always says they want the 5 9s, and I'm like, those are my favorite customers. I want the 5 9s because they have to get the checkbook out because to achieve that it costs a lot of money.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had questions about my SLA. My SLA was 99.5. They go, that's a bit, you know, bit ropey. That is. I go, well, here's why. And I went back to the customer. I go, this is why I can do it. The back end's different. Has a much tighter RPO, RTO, and SLA. This is for the front end. It can be much less than that. And obviously, as time goes on, as they expand, they may need to change it. And the design is flexible enough for that at every aspect. I go, but at the moment, these are the requirements that were fleshed out with the customer, and this is what the design is initially based on. And they were fine with that, and that's cool. I've justified it. I've shown why the business accepted it, why it was valid. And you can't really argue with it. You can try your best to, but in the day, I know the customer better than you do.
I think that's the key message. I think what you just said there, you know the customer. Well, you should do. Yeah, you should do. You know the customer. It's your customer.
Absolutely. They've just got your document to go by. Exactly. You're the one that toiled over it for 6 months or whatever, putting it together. So I know for a fact every design decision I did, I always weighed up the pros and cons of other possible decisions. Mm-hmm. You know, I'm in my mind.
Kind of going back to Paul's point on risk management. The other thing that's really great about if you go through the design methodology or properly document all your design decisions, especially around the risk, is I've had customers that came back to me 3 years ago, like 3 years later, and maybe management changed or the IT staff changed, and they're like, "Why did you do this? Like now we're in such trouble now. Like now we're pigeonholed. Like how could you do this to me?" And I'm like, "Well, like because here was all your requirements and constraints and the risks that we brought out, and you guys accepted this. Like this at the time was the best way to go." So it's also, in a real world example, it also helps cover, your own kind of back end and help protect against that thing. Because a lot of times there's a lot of turnover in IT and those sorts of things, or companies just forget the decisions they made 3 years ago. So it's really good to have that as a backup or guarantee.
I think that's happened to me a few times as well. You go through, especially when you're presenting to maybe a different team within. So I have a company at the moment where it's got follow the sun support. So you got lots of remote teams, and although I talk to them on WebEx like this, unless you have something documented, they say, "Oh, well, it was in one meeting. I remember you said X, Y, and Z," and suddenly things have changed. And it's nice to have this process that, no, I know exactly what the design decision was, this is how it is. And I think today I had a conversation with a team that hasn't followed this process, and they had a real bad time with one of the managers trying to justify and give out what they actually thought even a couple of weeks ago. The stuff was correct, it looked good. They just couldn't tell them why. They just lost that story. I think it really helps. It helps me every day, the whole process, I think.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you very much for that, guys. I appreciate it. I think we're almost finished. Thank you. I think we've run over a little bit, but I think it's been really good. Some nice questions and stuff. So I'm just going to do literally 5 minutes and then bring it all into a close. So as I said, I've been doing some mentoring. So hopefully you can see my screen now. Is that okay? Yeah, cool. So I've been doing some mentoring recently, and I pretty much, from the day I passed, I literally dived straight into mentoring. I think when the day I passed, or a couple of days after I passed, I got Paul's submission originally, and then it's just gone. It's just ballooned from there with all my blog posts and stuff. So I thought what I've seen is that pretty much, including myself, when I look back, we've all done the same kind of things. So there's similar issues. And again, when you go out for your reviews, I've had some I've had mixed emails. I've had people who haven't answered me and taken it quite badly. I've had people who have said, "Oh, that's a bit harsh," and it's like, well, it's only one opinion. You know, if you gave me your work to review and you gave Paul or Ballet, you know, or Jason, we'd have different comments. We'd have different thoughts. We do things differently. I think Paul said that, where everyone's got their own different opinion on how things work. We don't know the rubric, but we know what worked for us. But I think there's a lot of commonality around what seems to make a successful defence and what's not yet a successful defence. And I think risk and SLA is one of them. And lead time for the reviews, I think people, especially with the price increase, that may be something you can't do at the moment. You want to get it in there. But I think for me, I skip the review phase. I'll have a go. I'll see what happens. Hang on a minute. They've said I'll go in now. That was my journey.
That was my journey as well.
I didn't expect them to call me in the room the first time.
I submitted it and I was like, I'll get some feedback and I'll have some time to find out. Oh, congratulations. I'm like, oh, Paul.
I've got to go in now because that's it. Because the VCDX became a swear word in my house. And my wife said, you've got to submit now because you've been talking about it for so long. That was it. It was going in anyway.
My wife has the opposite problem. Anytime I'm losing an argument, I'm like, 206! And she's like, you can't use that as the ending of every argument. And I'm like,
4 9.
That's it. So there is that. So I think there was one blog post or a podcast where Greg Robertson, he said, get your partner support. I think that's a big deal, especially if you've got kids or you're married or whatever. I think that's a big thing. So what I've gone through is, I think a lot of these have been spoken about already. I think Paul did a great job on this. So risk, operationalizing your design, I think is one big thing. People just put down risk and don't put down the mitigation. Why do you do it? And I think one of the bugbears that I've had is, and I think it came up in one of the workshops. If you sit in front of me and you go, yes, I've mitigated that, I'm going to use VR Ops. And if you say VR Ops 3 times, I'm going to ask you a question about VR Ops. I'm going to ask you why, how you designed it, and go down that rabbit hole. And I did it myself. I'm not sure which badge. I'm not sure which alert. I'm not sure what a supermetric is. And you just open yourself up. But I think the way Paul put it was to say, here's a design risk. Here's the mitigation. I'm going to operationalize this by doing this procedure daily. And that's how I'm doing it. And that, once I started talking like that, it became a much easier defense. I think I did still get asked questions about the ops. I got asked detailed questions about various aspects of it because it was quite central to my design. But not.
Well, just one comment on that. I think, like, somebody was asking there about different tool sets, and I think way back, like when my design was a shambles 2 years ago, I got challenged with that. Like, you can't just introduce management tools because you think, so as Jason said, I like the UI on that tool. I mean, that is a real case of, you're introducing operational overhead, additional tool sets to manage that have to be patched, etc.
Exactly.
Don't do that unless you've got a good reason.
Unless there's a reason for it. And I think just saying you got some pretty lights or you got a nice GUI, but if you say, I've got this because it gives me this alert and this visibility and this type of thing specific, you can justify it. Otherwise, you just say, I put VROps in because it was nice or it gave me nice dashboards. They'll ask why. And I think that's a big thing. I think I've seen at least 4 people recently that have said VROps, and you go, why? And they go, and you can see how they've developed and so on. I did it. I did it. I'm there as well. But I think that's one thing to think about. Also, I think hidden logical decisions in requirements. I think this is one where people say, I think Simon Long put an article that says, would your business really say N+1? Or would they say, I need something to be never down, or I need it to be available? Or, for example, in this one, I've said the platform must have a pragmatic level of security. I doubt they'll say they need 802.1 QVLANs. I doubt they'll say they want specific TPS salt configuration. Having some sort of business journey, which we've gone through, and then saying, actually, I'm making a decision. So you need to have a pragmatic level of security all the way through from a conceptual design. Now I'm going to say, well, I could do physical separation, I could do logical separation, I could do an air gap, I could have NSX, for example, and do microsegmentation. I need to make some sort of decision. So in the conceptual design, it is business only. What the businessman would say. Yeah. One quick test for each requirement. Would a non-technical customer say that? And if they wouldn't, it might be worthwhile revisiting that, because it is a certification. Make your life easier for the exam. And I think by building on a decision that an architect would build. So the logical design, again, I see lots of vendors in logical design in some of the submissions. And I think all the things I'm looking at to review before they go submissions. And I think from that point of view, I think of it, a logical design goes out to tender. It could go out to any vendor. So I worked at a large company. They went to VMware, they went to Citrix, they went to Microsoft, and everyone could tender for it. So the logical design is that level. I know it's a VCDX, so you can mention VMware-ish, but I didn't. In my successful one, I didn't mention VMware at all in the logical design. And I think there's a really good article that Rene wrote that showed good logical design, which said hypervisor host instead of ESX host. Just simple things like that, just quick rewriting. And this is kind of looking at your 2 days or 3 days before you submit, what can you change quickly? And these are the kind of key things to check. Because I know if they are obvious to me now, and I've only been reviewing them for a little while, if I knew the rubric and I was an experienced panelist, these things would just jump out at me straight away. Yeah. And then, do I submit? Yeah. So I've got a little mind map here, and I'll put it up as a PDF. But I think overall formatting checklist, I think I was guilty of this. Table of contents I had, but list of figures and tables, easy to get through it. Lots of people put lots of information about what vMotion is and what DRS is and what the vCenter is. The guys know already, the people looking at it. They don't really need to know anything more. They've probably written the white papers. I know one of my panelists did. I know the papers he'd written. And I realized that what's the point me saying what the technology does? It was how I've used it and why. And I think that was more, that's what they're looking for. And I think Jason said earlier, he had 200 pages. If you have 800 pages or 600 pages because you've written about every single option you could possibly have, they're going to really love you, yeah, and also make it easy. So consistency across them. Some of the things I've seen as well is about the formula. Current state analysis and formulas on how to work out things, they're important, but I think put them in the appendix and just say the result in the physical design. That's just my opinion. It looks cleaner from my point of view, but if I need to know how you did it, I can go to the appendix and say, yes, that was the correct type of things. So Rene said this to me: is this your absolute best work? If not, Why are you even contemplating submitting? And I just admitted earlier, I think Ballet did the same. I put it in to see if I'd get how close I was. Now it's a bit different with the price increase, but there's that question. Has it been technically in business reviewed? Because we've all spoken that it's a mixture of things. And each area of the submission, I've got a little thought for each bit. So I'm not going to go through them all. I'm just going to have a chat, and then you can download it. I'll put it on my website later on. Risks, are they all mitigated? Accepted risks are still risks. Constraints, are they preventing areas of your blueprint? So I haven't, Ballet's making me laugh. Billet is making me laugh. Is that right?
Come on,
Bilal, sorry mate. I'm useless with names, ask Alaric.
No, it's all good.
But so we've been speaking about this earlier, so I think everyone has been saying the same common areas. All the things we've been mentioning, they've kind of been here, and I haven't really gone out to VCDXs and asked them, so we're all saying the common things. So are they all mitigated? Are constraints a bit of a crutch? Is it out of scope? Well, that doesn't matter because it's an exam and you need to do it. Too many hardware constraints. You got too many hardware constraints, you can't make any choices. So you can't show that you are an architect. So if you get things such as you've got a specific, you must use hyperconverged, you must use UCS, you must use a NetApp, you must use this. Well, you've just bought a VBlock. Okay, now you kind of can't really defend on all areas, and you're going to make your life a lot harder when you go into the defense. Some of the quick wins. If you're about to submit, what could you do to beef up your score? Me personally, I think stay logical and look at the data flow, look at diagrams, add in the flow across it. Make some detailed diagrams for that. How does the data flow between them? What's the business look like? What's the technical decisions you've made based for the business? In the validation guide, I used to be a tester years ago, and I think what the scope of testing, but really how are you proving you met your requirements? How do you prove you met your SLA? And then in the operationalizing of it, I think it's a big piece. Scaling it. For me, in my successful defense, that slide was up for a long time. How do I scale it? And I think Paul said it as well. Every single step. How long did it take you to order it? How long did it take you to get new kit on site? How long did it take you to get the port groups, the LUNs presented, and so on? Then look at things such as how do you upgrade it? How do you expand it? How do you patch it? And things such as power tests, black buildings. What happens if you're going to have a test when the power goes off? What's the process for that? And things that are not normally part of a day-to-day. I think these are the tick boxes to at least think of. Put a few lines in for each area, so at least you've covered it as much as possible. So I think even down to the application. So me personally, I think it's about validation. If you look on some of the websites, I think Chris Caloiti said it's a validation. It's not a certification to study for. Me personally, I disagree. I think you can study for it, but they are going to look at your design experience. You are going to look at what things you do outside. So things like your soft skills, your speaking activities, and so on. You could talk about that. In the install guides, I've seen people go through every single screenshot. Why recreate standard documentation? Just put the information that is there that needs to be placed in the computer at the time. So here we got install config. I don't care. I just say what order it is, what the unique material is, and the settings you need to put in. Everything else, I just give links to the standard docs and say where they are. That's how I achieved it. I didn't really start writing down lots of things. In the application, by the time you've done your application, check the page numbers before you're doing your final check. You give references to the page numbers, and I found just before I was about to hit the submit button, those numbers weren't quite right, and I had to go back and check them, especially if you're leaving it to the last few minutes. I think going through each one of these, make sure you've got at least a couple of lines for each area. Yeah, make sure you've got some considerations around it, and then think about these last bits. Is there any material that explains technology? Remove it. Have you shown all areas of the blueprint? And all areas are supported. So are all areas a supported configuration? Is that important? Pretty much yes, but I know at least 2 VCDXs who have submitted something that isn't supported, but they had a lot of justification and a use case for it. Yeah. So it's really how you tell the story. Yeah. So I think there's quite a lot in there, and we've been speaking, a lot of it's been covered, but I thought that might be useful for people just before they go in and submit it. Have I covered everything? So if it's interesting, I'll put a copy on PDF for you. Cool. Any questions, guys? Anyone? Any questions to any of the guys on the call today who's presented? Anything you want to talk about before we close?
I think everybody's gone to sleep.
I think so.
It's like 1:30 in the morning here.
I'm hanging on.
Cool, all good. I think. Yes, no problem. I will send over a copy of this to you. And also, yes, there's someone asking me about a design review. I will look at that tomorrow morning, and you can have a copy. I'll give you the review. But yes, I'm looking to give a copy of this recording as soon as possible. It should be the next couple of days. Thanks again for all the guys who've presented and taken time out, especially due to the time of night it is. So I definitely appreciate it, and hopefully I'll see you all at VMworld. Cool. Cheers, guys.
No
Thank you
worries.
very much.
Catch you later.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.